payment in the US. So my research aimed to answer the question, how have the growth, adoption, and consumer trust of contactless payments evolved in the United States? On today's agenda, I will first cover some key terms and theories related to my research, then provide historical context and present the 2 case studies I conducted, as well as the key findings, and finally end with a conclusion and a Q&A session. So what exactly is a contactless payment? Well, my research was very similar to Mayari's, but a contactless payment is a method of payment that eliminates any physical contact between the buyer's payment method and the seller's register or point of sales terminal. Near-field communication is a short-range wireless technology that is very related to this because it lets other NFC-enabled devices to connect with each other and complete the transaction. EMV, which is short for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, is a global security standard that processes these secure payment methods with one's EMV, credit, or debit card. And a mobile payment is a method of payment made through a portable electronic device, such as one's smartphone or smartwatch. I analyzed 2 key theories for this research. The first one was a technology acceptance model, or TAM for short. TAM tries to understand why people accept or reject new technology. And there are 2 aspects which mainly influence this, which is number 1, the perceived usefulness, which means whether or not the consumer believes it will be useful to them to use. And number 2, the perceived ease of use, meaning whether or not they believe it will be easy to implement into their daily lives. And this relates to contactless payments because it is a relatively new technology, and if the consumers of this believe that it will be easy to use as well as very useful to them, they'll be more likely to implement this. And the diffusion of innovation theory, or DOI for short, is explaining how, why, and at what speed new innovations spread. And there's also several factors that influence this, such as communication channels, which are how the new technologies is spread through media or the news, as well as time and technology adopters, which are the types of people who implement this. It ranges from the innovators themselves to the late majority, as well as the laggards. And this is also relevant to my research because, as you know, before COVID, contactless payments were not very frequent, but with the situational influence, it really impacted it and allowed people to start implementing it into their lives. To provide some historical context, the first contactless payment method was first seen in 1997 in the US. It was ExxonMobil's SpeedPass, which was a NFC-enabled gas payment method, and it was a keychain fob that users could tap to the payment acceptor to make a very quick contactless payment. And in the early 2000s, card issuers as well as major banks started issuing their contactless cards, but this didn't gain much traction until COVID-19 hit. With the start of social distancing and the minimization of contact, there was an increase of contactless payments from 37% in 2019 to 53% in 2021. So COVID-19 is the biggest influence on contactless payments growth over the years. Its situational influence impacted how users believed that it would help them, as well as the ease of use, which I will later cover in my first case study. So moving on to my first case study, I analyzed the pre-COVID implementations in the US that led to a smoother transaction and transition to contactless payments. So as I mentioned before, in the early 2000s, these card issuers and major banks started advocating for the adoption of these cards. But there are several problems, including the fact that the merchant would have to upgrade their point of sales terminal to accept these payments, and it was very pricey, so they were hesitant about whether or not they would make money by implementing this in. And this resulted in users who did have it on them not being able to try out the contactless payment. This led to a self-replicating problem where the merchants don't upgrade their terminals to accept these contactless payments, and the customer could not try it out. There was also a lack of user perception and acceptance of this because of a theory that a robber could stand next to you with like a contactless acceptor and steal your information as well as your money. But even though the likelihood of this was very low, many people were scared of this and reluctant to try it out. However, there are 2 main events that led to the contactless payment research. The first one was a nationwide EMV migration from 2013 to 2015. They enforced many mandatory regulations across the US, including the mandatory POS upgrade. This solved the problem on the merchant side, as they reached the same level of consistency of accepting these payment methods. And the second event was the launch of Apple Pay and Samsung Pay in 2014 and 2015. This made contactless payments much more available to people because, as you know, smartphones are very important in society to this day, and anyone who had a Samsung or Apple iPhone were able to try this out for themselves. So overall, the early pre-COVID setup of these point-of-sales, terminal upgrades, and mobile payments allowed for a smoother transition into contactless payments when coronavirus did hit. My second case study focuses on the California public transit system. Before I go into it, I would first like to introduce two more key theories, or key terms. The first is the original payment system called the closed-loop payment method. It's an agency-specific payment method using an issued card or ticket in a private ticketing system. For example, subway cards as well as gift cards for different stores are an example of this, because you can only use, for example, your Starbucks gift card to pay for Starbucks. You can't use it to buy or do anything else. However, the newer system is the open-loop payment method, which is a payment method using these contactless EMV, credit or debit cards, or a mobile payment. And this is much more versatile because users are able to implement it much more easily. And for example, when they travel or move to a new place, it is much easier to use. The California Integrated Travel Project, or CAL-ITP for short, was founded in 2019 with the goal to make public transport in California simpler and more cost-effective for everyone. The problem was an increasingly cashless modern society, as well as inconsistencies among these transport payment methods, as well as the hit of COVID and sanitary precautions. Many users were stopping the use of public transport completely. But the solution was, in 2021, CAL-ITP implemented the contactless payment acceptors all across the state of California. This led to an increase in convenience, efficiency, and hygiene. So overall, by adding contactless payment acceptors in public transport systems, it adopted a consistent method of collecting fares across public transport. The two case studies led to some key findings. In my first case study, I found that nationwide regulations and the launching of mobile payments before COVID facilitated a faster transition to contactless payments. And in my second case study, I found that, specifically in the public transport industry, the US adapted to COVID sanitary precautions and increased convenience and speed of transport with the help of contactless payments. In conclusion, contactless payments have seen a rapid increase in usage and growth due to COVID-19, along with the help of previously adopted technology. In addition, after COVID-19 hit, contactless payments have been utilized across many industries in the US for convenience, speed, and hygiene. However, there are several limitations to this because, as I mentioned before in the historical context, the speed pass was not used very much until, I think, recently, and they kind of changed it to a website for ExxonMobil, as well as the fact that contactless payment is a very new technology, so it's constantly evolving and changing. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
After they adopted the card for the California transport system, and more people started using public transport, and what impact could it have on the
So the first, it made two major impacts on their public transport system. First, it made it just relatively generally easier and much more convenient for people as well as travelers to use, because they now don't have to buy that specific ticket or a card, and they could just use their mobile payment or their contactless credit or debit card. And in the context of COVID-19, it also made it much more sanitary because you don't have to be handling physical cash as well as making physical contact with other people. And yeah, so it sped things up a lot.
You mentioned earlier that if someone was to stand next to you with the card reader, they could potentially steal your money. Do you know if there was any solution
So actually, in my key terms, I mentioned EMV, which is the security standard for most contactless credit and debit cards. So it works alongside with NFC to ensure that there's like a really secure, I guess, transaction payment method. So each time you insert it in or make a payment, it makes like a new tokenized, I think, 6-digit code. So most people cannot hack into it with like regular hacking techniques. So that really reduced that. And it's a really unlikely scenario, and people also started buying like RFID blocking wallets as well as purses to like lessen the percentage or like likelihood of that.
What if I could do like from the banks, they like issue new cards with them about like contactless payments and constantly giving the user of the client sort of the choice to send in like a card that has already been chip in it? Would you think that push the move forward as well?
I'm actually not sure, but COVID was the biggest influence on this. I think even though they did try to have their customers use it, they're a lot less like, I guess, accepting of it because not, for example, if your neighbor starts talking to you about how their contactless card, you can just like tap it, you would be more likely to use it, and that is the theory of TAM. And so with the start of COVID, many people were experiencing like sanitary precautions and concerns, so they're like, oh, I need to find a way better than cash, or swiping it, which is also like very risky and could lead to a lot more like hacking problems. And so I think before COVID, not many people did try it out because they had to like go and actively like request it, which was not very convenient for everyone.
How is like the surge in contactless payment affecting populations of people who maybe get paid primarily in cash, but maybe taking on the resources to register for banks or these sorts of systems?
So I think before COVID, as you mentioned, a lot of people are paid mainly in cash, especially in lower income families and communities. But I think similar to your research project, it's becoming like a big government thing as well. So they might provide more support for those people and provide them like postage as well.